Well,
we are live.
We are indeed live.
Indeed. Holy cow.
For everybody who's already waiting for us with bated breath, we are live calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
I'm here in Chicago, and how are you today? What's going on in London?
Not much. I had a great 4 days at the Chelsea History Festival. It was the Geek
fantastic.
Fest. Got to meet lots of authors. Some History Happy Hour alumni were there speaking.
And some future History Happy Hour authors, I hope, as well. Yeah. Excellent. Well, we want to welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, which is brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I, as most of you know, can be found here every Sunday cracking open the good stuff and talking some history. And a big thank you to the list of folks who are supporting this effort via Patreon, especially our top shelf sponsors or supporters. And Chris, who are those fine people?
Those fine people are Stephen Ferber, Stephen Dean, Eric Flint, Doug McCord, Ted Moon, Pamela Ryman, Chris Templin, Neil Hilliard, Ward Cornett, Phil Messina, Bonnie Icestone, and Doreen Gibson. And I'm just thrilled that it's taking me so long to say this because it used to just be a couple names I could rattle off, but now I have to look.
Right, so pretty soon we may have to go to the visual, popping up the visual for those folks. But we're not quite there yet.
But we do appreciate it.
Yes, we do. And if you want to help keep the history taps open, you can go to patreon.com/historyhappyhour and, spend every dime you have on history, and it's certainly, I think, is worthwhile. And so, who's here, Chris? Who have we got so far?
Well, we have Lizzie Borden from London, John Matthews from Toronto, who says all the time that he's just not really sure about Vancouver, but we'll get to that later.
Oh, okay.
Stephen.
We got Gail
Stephen
Wright.
Dean.
Stephen Dean's here. Gail Wright from Austin, Texas. Lynn Hargrove. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention Marcus, who was here before anybody, as usual.
We can't start unless Marcus is there.
And Pierre. But I think we've killed enough time now.
I think so. Yes.
That we can get going. So if you'll give me the cue, I'll try to find the button and play the open.
All right.
The bar is open, and boy, today we are all about getting drunk.
I mean, how appropriate.
On History Happy Hour, because our topic today is the role of drinking in the rise of civilization. And our guest is Dr. Edward Slingerland, who is the author of a new book called Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. This is a very entertaining book that combines history and archaeology, literature, psychology, genetics, and all sorts of stuff that's way beyond me, but it's really quite fascinating. And I want to mention that Dr. Slingerland, I'm already choking up. I'm choking up, Chris, because of this topic. Dr. Slingerland is a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, John Matthews, where he also holds appointments in the departments of psychology and Asian studies. He's also the author of numerous other books. Ted Slingerland, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thanks for having me.
We're delighted you're here. I first of all, I want to say I cannot think of a topic more in sync with the very idea of History Happy Hour, which benefits from the lubricating power of alcohol. Here in our 76th episode, we have reached nirvana. I think you are our ultimate guest.
All right.
Wow, you are wound up tonight.
He is.
He's really wound up. Yeah.
You complete us.
All right.
All right, wait a minute.
And it's going to be
Have we started drinking yet?
Yeah.
Oddly, no.
This is the kind of shit people
but
say.
it gets even better once I do. So it would be very disappointing if you didn't bring a cocktail to this show.
Okay, no, I brought one.
Okay, excellent.
I have a BC Viognier.
Oh, fantastic.
So I hear that in the Toronto area they also grow some sort of wine, but this is actually real wine.
Okay, and I have just a nice anti-hero IPA. And Chris, what did you bring to the table?
Cider.
All right, cheers.
Cheers to everybody. So, the first question: how does a professor of philosophy, religious studies, sinology, Chinese studies, which you've also been involved in, become inspired to write a book about how intoxication has played a critical role in the development of human society?
That's what all my colleagues are asking. They would like an answer to that.
And was alcohol involved in that process?
It may have been, yeah. Anything good, it's usually involved at some level. There's two routes into this project, really. The first is my longstanding interest in spontaneity. So my first trade book was called Trying Not to Try. And it was about this early Chinese ideal of wu wei, effortless action, where it's kind of like flow or being in the zone in sports. You're in a state where you are relaxed, everything's working out perfectly, you lose a sense of yourself as an agent, you're charismatic, people like you, you're socially successful. For the early Chinese thinkers I look at, this is the spiritual goal is to get you into the state of wu wei. But they have this problem, and this is the paradox that I call the paradox of wu wei, or the problem of how do you try not to try. So you know that spontaneity is something you want to get into, you know that creativity is something you want, but how do you try to be spontaneous, or how do you try to be creative? It's a direct paradox, and in the book I point out that it actually is directly a cognitive paradox. So if you're trying to relax or trying to have fun, the part of your brain you're activating when you're trying is actually the part you're trying to shut down, the prefrontal cortex, right? So it's directly, you're activating the thing you want to stop. And so in that book, I walk through the various strategies the early Chinese thinkers have for getting you around this paradox. There's a story, though, in one of these Taoist texts where they compare the Taoist sage to a drunken person. So he's riding in a cart and he falls off, but he's not hurt because he didn't know he was riding. He doesn't know he's fallen out. His spirit is whole. He's got to relax, and he just rolls with it. And it's clearly meant as a metaphor. So at the end of the passage, the Zhuangzi, the Taoist thinker, says, if you can be this whole with alcohol, being drunk on alcohol, how much more so if you were drunk on heaven, this spiritual force he wants you to get in touch with. But the story made me think, you know what? There's this paradox. How do you shut down your prefrontal cortex when conscious effort activates it? What if you had a technology that would just reach in and do it directly for you? It would down-regulate it for you and get you around the cognitive paradox. So that made me start thinking about how cultures might use alcohol as a tool to essentially solve this problem of how do we get people into a spontaneous state.
So, and you say, and I'm just a little bit of a quote here, is that what this means is that most of what we think we know about intoxication is wrong, incoherent, incomplete, or all of the above. So We'll get into that, but is that disconnect a recent phenomenon, or is that?
I think it's been worse maybe recently, because what is more recent is the medicalization of discussions of intoxicants. So the only lens through which we talk about intoxicants now is a medical lens. So we talk about the obvious health risks. It's bad for your liver, it increases your cancer risk. There's alcoholism, so we view it through the lens of the serious problem of alcoholism. It's probably the case that up to maybe 12-15% of the human population has a genetic propensity to alcoholism. So people with certain genetic tendencies can't drink safely. And it could really, anyone who's known an alcoholic knows, it's really dangerous. So these are all real problems, real costs, and we should pay attention to them. But that's the only way we look at alcohol. It's always through just costs. And I think what we've been blind to, what traditional cultures have had a better sense of, and that I think modern society kind of has lost touch with, is the positive aspects of alcohol, the way it's used to enhance creativity, to enhance social bonding, to relax people, even like basic effects like relaxing you at the end of the day, and marking the transition from the work day to the leisure day, relaxing people on a first date. Why do people on a first date, they go and they have dinner and they have some wine? Why do they do that? Because they want to down-regulate their PFC a little bit and relax because they're nervous. And so I think we've lost sight. Traditional cultures have been clearer, I think, about these positive functions. And I think that's been lost recently through this medicalization and also through what I call in the book this neo-Puritan attitude, where we're very uncomfortable with anything that gives us pleasure. It's weird, but I think that's a factor as well.
I'm going to down-regulate my PFC for a moment.
Yeah, that's all.
There's a lot of elements to this story and to your kind of thesis and how you lay this out. And let's go back, though, since we're a history show. When does alcohol make its entrance on the scene? Where is humanity at that moment? And what is the interplay there between the development and manufacture of alcohol and the development of civilization? I know that you basically have to read me the entire book to answer that question, but you can come up with a slightly shorter version of it.
Yeah, the short story is that we've been producing and consuming alcohol for as long as we've been doing anything in an organized fashion as a species. So there's evidence that, we've been drinking, there's pictorial evidence that suggests drinking going back like 20,000 years. We have direct evidence of alcohol production 13,000 years ago, so way before agriculture. And this is what surprised me when I started doing the research for the book. I had always been taught and kind of assumed that alcohol was a byproduct of agriculture. So people figured out agriculture, then they had grains, and they would leave their sourdough starter out too long and it would bubble, and they'd go, oh, this is interesting tasting. And that's how we discovered beer. It actually looks like it's the other way around. So people were making beer thousands and thousands of years before we had agriculture. So you have sites like Göbekli Tepe in what's present-day Turkey, probably 10 to 12,000 year old site. These were hunter-gatherers who were coming from all over, gathering at this site, constructing this monumental architecture, these huge stones. It kind of looks like Stonehenge. These stone steles are carved with these designs. They were having these blowout festivals. We have evidence of feasting, animal bones, and then big vats that held some kind of liquid. And we don't have direct residue evidence, but we know beer was being made in the region at the time. So it's almost certainly the case that they were making beer, and that beer was one of the main draws that were bringing these hunter-gatherers together. So this is the hypothesis is sometimes called beer before bread, that it was actually the desire to get drunk that motivated human beings to start paying attention to certain plants and domesticating them and making them more productive, and finally inducing them to settle down. So if this is right, and you see this across the world, it's not just in the Fertile Crescent, in other parts of the world, the first plants that are domesticated seem to have been singled out for their psychotropic qualities, not for their nutrition qualities. So if this is the case, there's a very direct sense in which our desire to get drunk actually created civilization. It's what caused us to settle down.
It sort of lures us. I think you used the phrase that it lures us into civilization. It's like, hey, come here with the other
there's
people.
Beer.
Hey, there's beer. Come plant the fields and do stuff because there's beer.
Yeah. And then once it's lured us in, it helps us deal with the transition as well. So the transition from hunter-gatherer society to early agricultural society was probably not awesome for most people. It's all right if you were the high priest, maybe, but it's there's evidence that our diets got worse; they got more monotonous. Hunter-gatherers eat a pretty rich, diverse diet of plants and fruits and some meats. Suddenly, we're surviving on starches, mostly starches. Hunter-gatherer, at least in this part of the world, the Fertile Crescent, hunter-gatherer bands were pretty egalitarian, so not a lot of hierarchy. Everyone kind of had a say in how things were run. Once you get into agricultural communities, suddenly you have social stratification. So there's a really strong hierarchy. You're suddenly crammed together with lots of strangers, which is really unusual for us as a species. Primates don't like to be crammed together with strangers like that. So I think part of what's going on here is it lures us into these dense hierarchical societies, and then it helps us cope with them. So it's beer also then at the end of the day, if you're a worker and you've been building pyramids all day, at least you have beer to help you relax. So there's some evidence that one of the effects of alcohol is to kind of reduce the stress of living in large scale societies.
So then, what you're saying then is it's alcohol is an evolutionary requirement. Then it's not kind of like the icing on the cake.
Yeah, there's other ways you can do it, right? There's other substances you can use. So there's other chemical intoxicants like cannabis. There are other ways to get some of the effects of alcohol. So singing and dancing, group rituals, where especially if you're doing it really intensely and combining it with either sleep deprivation or physical pain. So rituals where you're actually doing things that activate your pain sensors. You can get some of the same effects as you get with alcohol. And religious groups that don't, for various reasons, ban alcohol use a lot of these techniques. So there are a lot of ways you can do this. But alcohol is one of the most widespread and ancient technologies for pulling this off, and for very good reason. If you wanted an engineering team to design a substance that would have these functional effects, they would come up with something very much like alcohol.
Because it's so easily processed, because it has a sort of a broad effect, and it's not, and because it's easily dosed, and all those reasons. It's like it's almost like nature said, here's this technology for bringing these primates with these big brains that they don't know what to do with together, so that they can do something with them. We do have a question from Ken Rettig, who wants to know what did pre-agricultural humans make their alcohol from?
Wild grains. So, the stuff that basically eventually became domesticated. So in the Fertile Crescent, they were making beer out of the precursors to wheat and rye and things like that. In South America, they were making alcohol out of teosinte, which is the wild ancestor of maize, so the ancestor of corn, and which incidentally makes terrible grain. So you would never notice teosinte if you were interested in making tortillas, but it makes very good beer.
So it wasn't accidentally discovered because somebody was trying to make a cake with it. It was.
It's unlikely. It seems like it was being cultivated for use in making chicha, which is a beer-like substance. And then in other parts of the world, people were making fruit wines, so they were, fermenting mixes of fruits and grains. People have been, anything that's got sugars, people will turn into alcohol, and they're really inventive. In Tasmania, they would actually tap gum trees and let the gum seep down the side and gather in a bowl and just leave it there and let it ferment with natural yeast in the air and make an alcoholic beverage. So people will make alcohol out of anything.
So are there some theories as to how this magic moment all comes about? I mean, because it seems like all cultures all throughout the world come to the same conclusion on their own, but they'll say, hey, we got to do something here, and this is what we can do. Do they have any theories or thoughts as to where this bright idea comes from? Or?
Fermentation is pretty easy to discover because it happens spontaneously.
Right.
Unlike, say, bread making. Like bread making, how do people figure out how to make bread that rises? It's just really mysterious to me. Whereas, and beer has got a couple steps to it. It's not super simple, but certainly grape fruit wines are really easy. They happen naturally. People would notice that fruit that's overripe and rotten would start to change. They would try it, and it would make them a little bit high, and they would say, hey, what if we let this sit for longer? So that's one of the features of alcohol that makes it, I call it in the book, the king of intoxicants, because it's so widespread and ancient, and it's probably because it is so easy to discover.
Chris, I'm going to bring in another question here.
Sure.
This is sort of kind of interesting question here from Alice, and she says, even if alcohol was historically important to bonding, is it possible that people's preferences have changed? Alcohol consumption has decreased in Europe. Are they ill-informed, or is it less useful now than it used to be? And I know this touches on a lot of things. It kind of jumps ahead, but I thought it was an interesting way of thinking about it, to put it to you.
Yeah, so alcohol in the modern world has changed quite a bit. And the last chapter of the book's dedicated to what I call the dark side of Dionysus and to the novel dangers of alcohol. So for most of our history, we've been drinking pretty weak forms of alcohol. So we've been drinking beers that have been like 2 to 3% ABV. Fruit wines would get higher, but not that much higher. So if you're drinking a 2 to 3% ABV beer, it's hard to get into dangerously inebriated territory. You can drink it, you can socialize, you can have it. In Europe, they would drink it at breakfast, right? It's like you would just have in the morning because it was not very strong. But with modern yeasts, you have craft beers now that are clocking in at like 9, 10, 11% ABV. And then, Australian Shiraz can get up to like 16, 17%. And then you have, and it's relatively recent technology, a few hundred years ago in Europe, distillation. So once primates figure out a way, alcohol comes with a built-in safety feature, which is that, the yeast are taking sugars or turning them into alcohol. At a certain point, they poison themselves. They're resistant to alcohol, but not infinitely. And so at a certain point, the yeast shut down because they poison themselves. So there's an upper limit on natural fermentation. And humans have been kind of bumping up against that limit for most of our history. And then about 200-300 years ago, we figured out how to practically do distillation. We've known about the principle for a very long time, but it's actually hard to pull off technologically. Once you get distillation, you can, you heat up a weak beer, you boil off the ethanol first, and you capture that, turn it back into a liquid. You do it again, you can get like 90-something% alcoholic beverage. That's what vodkas come in at. And that is so much stronger than anything we've ever had. It really should be considered a different drug. It's still ethanol, but it's so much more powerful and so much more dangerous than traditional forms of alcohol. So that's one reason I think people might start drinking less, is just alcohol is more dangerous than it used to be. It's a much more potent substance than the stuff we were traditionally used to.
So in the book, you say that far from being an evolutionary mistake, chemical intoxicants help solve a number of distinctively human challenges. We could not be a civilization without intoxication. So what are some of the challenges that this helps us get around?
So I talk about humans, the 3 C's. So we're the creative, cultural, and communal animal. So to a degree, that is just, there's no close comparison in the animal world. We're dependent on creativity. So we are completely dependent on tool use, to the point that we're biologically dependent on it. So we can't really live on raw food anymore. We've adapted biologically to fire, and fire is a tool. Fire is not just out there in the world for humans to have. So human societies, in a way that is not true of lions or gazelles, to survive have to be constantly innovating. They have to be constantly changing their tool sets. The environment's changing. If the environment's not changing, you've got competing cultural groups who have maybe better tool sets than you and are innovating faster than you are. So we're really dependent on creativity. And that's one of the ways in which alcohol helps. So by turning down the prefrontal cortex a couple notches, it helps us engage in lateral thinking. So I talk in the book about, there's a big body of literature on how in the book in general, the PFC is the enemy. So the prefrontal cortex is a really important part of our brains, and we have it for good reason. It's the center of cognitive control, executive function.
I really never thought we would be discussing the prefrontal cortex
in your
History
show,
Happy Hour and attacking it.
I'm a big fan of the prefrontal cortex. And I want my daughter to develop hers as quickly as possible, right? But it doesn't develop until the 20s. So it's really late developing. And it helps you focus. It helps you control impulses. It helps you resist temptations. But it narrows your focus in a way that's not helpful for creativity. So people with damaged PFCs are better at creative tasks. And people with damaged PFCs, in other words, 4-year-olds who just don't have PFCs yet, are much better at creative tasks than grown-ups are. And so one of the ways, so we need to have creativity, but we also need to be grown-ups. You don't want 4-year-olds in charge of R&D. And so how do you pull that off? One way to do it is to temporarily turn yourself back into a child. So, and you have all the knowledge and skills that you have as an adult, but you have a few beers, and for 2 or 3 hours, you can turn yourself, at least get closer to the kind of mental flexibility that you had when you were a 5-year-old. And so that's one of the challenges is we have to be creative. This is one technology we can use to help with creativity.
And you also talk about how, I think most of us, a conventional societal viewpoint today would be that if someone is drunk, well, you're not in a position to really be considering anything important, or don't make decisions under the influence, save that for another day. But you talk about some cultures that essentially have required drinking to be part of key decision making or key negotiations with enemies and stuff. So it plays another role there.
Yeah, and so another thing that's unusual about humans is we cooperate with strangers all the time. And we cooperate in strangers all the time in situations that involve cooperation dilemmas. And so these go by a bunch of different names in economic theory: prisoner's dilemma or tragedy of the commons. There are a lot of situations where you get the best payoff for everyone if you just trust the other person. If you trust the other person, everyone will be better off. But you're vulnerable to what economists call defection. You're vulnerable to being taken advantage of, basically. And so rational agents, people who are just following their own rational self-interest, will tend to not get the best outcome because they are protecting themselves. And yet in the real world, people solve prisoners' dilemmas all the time. And alcohol is one of the ways you do it. So another function, I argue, is you got a bunch of potentially hostile people who need to come to an agreement. They'll be better off if they can come to an agreement, but they have competing interests. They're a little worried about the other people. They don't trust them. When they meet, they shake hands to show that, hey, I'm not carrying a physical weapon. And then they sit down and they drink. And they sit down and they drink because they're also, when you drink, I'm arguing it's essentially you're taking your PFC out and putting it on the table and saying, I'm cognitively disarmed. I don't have cognitive control anymore. And so I look at evidence that suggests that if you're a bit inebriated, if your PFC is downregulated, it's harder to lie. Lying is a really challenging from a cognitive perspective task. You got to keep in your head what the true situation is, which is not real, what you're saying. And then you have to keep in head what you're saying. You have to suppress emotional leakage. So any reactions that wouldn't be consistent with what you're saying is reality. It's really hard to lie. And so if you can impair the PFC, you make it harder for people to lie. Another thing alcohol is doing at the same time is boosting this kind of feel-good hormone, so endorphin, serotonin. And so you just like other people more. You like yourself more, you like other people more, you're more expansive, you're more likely to trust other people, you're more likely to think that they're a good person. And so it helps people ease their way past these cooperation dilemmas. And that's why historically, any kind of treaty gathering, contract signing, any difficult negotiation was done with the use of intoxicants of some kind, usually alcohol.
So can you pick up on it? I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say in many cultures. I mean, that's what was interesting as you read about this. It's in Europe, it's in China, it's in Russia. It's it's in native cultures where maybe they don't have alcohol, but they're smoking a peace pipe with hallucinogens in it. So it's really, really, really widespread.
Yeah, that's everywhere for a very good reason.
Yeah, no. So since this is History Happy Hour, I mean, are there some kind of historical examples you think of society that have used alcohol and like how that's helped in either reaching a decision or arriving at an inflection point or something? Like I know you talk a lot about the Greeks, for example.
Yeah, I mean, and so my specialty is early China, and every single early Chinese treaty meeting between states involved these banquets where you were drinking large quantities of alcohol. There's actually, I quote this passage from a recently discovered text. So there's this cool thing in my field is we've dug up these bamboo texts that were buried for a while. So it's ink on bamboo. And one of these texts has a line that says, it's through the use of alcohol that harmony between the states is established, basically. So, there's a very strong belief in early China that you couldn't get past mutual suspicion, and mutual self-interest without alcohol. And so I talk in the book, there's lots of anecdotes about breakthroughs that happened diplomatically when people sat down in a room together and drank. Nixon famously said that, if we drink enough Mao Tai, there's nothing that we can't do when he went to reestablish relationships with China. You see this in the way politicians use alcohol. You see it in the way that business people use alcohol, right? There's a reason that when Skype was invented, everyone said, oh, well, business travel is going to stop, because why would you fly to Shanghai if you could just Skype with people there and reach an agreement? People, until the pandemic, at least, people kept flying to Shanghai. And that's because if anything more complicated than, making buttons for someone, there's so many degrees of freedom where people could do the wrong thing or screw you over or not have your best interests in heart, that you want to sit down and have a meal and have alcohol with these people before you're gonna feel comfortable.
Yeah. We have one of our viewers was talking about Washington and says alcohol consumption is very high in Washington. How does it influence the political public policy and advocacy process? I'm thinking maybe, this is just my 2 cents here, but that maybe the people aren't getting together nearly enough and having drinks with the people on the other side. That you actually have to include a larger group of people if you want that to get the positive benefits of that.
Yeah, there's some evidence that this is where breakthroughs between Republicans and Democrats happened, was at watering holes where people would gather. And so it's off the record, you have a few glasses of wine and you talk off the record and things get worked out. And one of the problems is this isn't happening very much anymore. People are segregated into, the Republicans go to the Trump Hotel and drink with fellow Republicans. There's not places where people mix anymore. There's also, it was interesting, I was interviewed by someone who's a political scientist and interested in politics. And it's interesting. So Joe Biden doesn't drink. And he also famously, when he was, before he was president, he would always go back to Delaware every day. So he would get on the train at the end of the day and go home. And it's kind of sweet thing, he wanted to be with his family, but he also then missed out on the after hours drinkings that would happen with people who were, there in Washington hanging out in the evenings. And there's some speculation that this may have caused some problems with his ability to network or get people to agree on things, because he wasn't plugged into the kind of alcohol lubricated informal networks that tend to make things happen in politics.
I'm going to add one more viewer question,
please.
Chris,
Yeah,
and then we'll jump back to you. But we'll ask. But this is it's perfectly fair to push back, I think, against some of this a little bit. And as somebody points out, Wally Morrison says, some people get a mean and aggressive. It isn't always bringing about cooperation. And you do talk a little bit about the dark sides in the book, but it is there's always that other side of it.
Yeah. So the people who get mean and aggressive when they drink are mean and aggressive people. So I think there's this kind of myth that alcohol makes you mean and aggressive. And that's not true. So alcohol, what it's doing is disinhibiting you. So when it turns down the PFC, it's taking away the playground monitor. So the part of your brain that normally monitors social norms and kind of knows what's the right thing to do, appropriate thing to do, that thing's gone or impaired. And so your real tendencies come out, your real impulses come out. So people who are mean drunk are mean people. And this is coming out when they drink. So it does have these negative effects. These negative effects, the really kind of, the fighting and the violence, physical violence, you tend to get at high levels of inebriation. So blowing past, what I argue in the book is a lot of these social benefits, enhanced creativity, enhanced bonding, liking, you're getting these at about 0.08 blood alcohol content. So that's about two beers in maybe. Once you start getting into higher levels of 0.15, you get up to 0.20, then you start losing motor functions. You start really seriously losing your inhibitions in a way that can be dangerous. And again, it's hard to do that traditionally drinking 2 to 3% beers. If you're doing shots of tequila, you can get there in 20 minutes. And so this is another way in which distilled liquors are really dangerous. They can get you to that really dangerous level of drunkenness very quickly.
So,
I can hear you.
Oh, Rick.
No, Rick.
Once a show, he silences himself.
I don't think so. You're describing an alternate way that we could handle History Happy Hour, right? So that we could, if Chris and I were drinking tequila by later in the show, it would be a much more potentially uninhibited, aggressive questioning session.
I'm not sure. I'd probably tune out at some point.
Yeah. You might suddenly have technical difficulties at that point.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So, is there any way to measure? I mean, we've talked about how different societies have used alcohol. It's been a social lubricant. It's kind of helped with advancing civilization. Is there any way to measure like certain societies that did better because of this? Something. So, like in Islam, of course, there's no alcohol, but it'd be hard to argue that they haven't progressed.
Right.
I mean, so how do you measure all of this?
Yeah. So what I argue in the book, so from a cultural evolutionary perspective, if alcohol didn't have positive functions, you'd expect that societies that didn't use alcohol should just immediately wipe out societies that do. Alcohol imposes all these costs. It's economically really costly. So in ancient Sumer, they estimate that half the grain production went to beer, making beer. So you've got half of your grain is being used to make a low-dose neurotoxin. That low-dose neurotoxin is fueling misbehavior on the part of people with alcoholic tendencies. It's damaging people's livers. It's raising their cancer rates. It's giving them hangovers. It's leaving them inebriated and kind of somewhat helpless in the evenings when maybe someone could attack. You would think that cultures that just got rid of alcohol would just do so much better than cultures that don't. So that's some measure, in my mind, that's some measure of, gives you a sense of what alcohol must be giving you as a culture, because it's against all those costs. It's remained in the cultural repertoire for thousands and thousands of years. And if you look at a map of the world right now, and you look at how many places are genuinely completely dry, there are not that many. And that should surprise us more than it does. When Islam took seriously, I mean, the prohibition against alcohol wasn't from the very beginning, but it was fairly early, and it was taken seriously in a lot of places. I talk in the book about this encounter between this Islamic emissary who was going to check on some recent converts in what's now Russia, and ran into a bunch of Vikings. And it's a great account because this person was admired, was impressed. They were tall and warlike and kind of impressive, but he was horrified by their animalistic behavior because they just got drunk every night. They were drunk during the day. They would hurt each other. They would get into drunken fights and hurt each other. They would. I think one person actually died of alcohol poisoning while he was there. So here's this two cultures coming into contact, right? Islam and Viking culture. Islam should have kicked their asses. I mean, these people should have been wiped out, and yet they weren't. The Vikings were actually a very successful cultural group. A good proportion of Northern Europe's populations descended.
Turns out we're all Vikings. Yeah,
we're all Vikings, right? They did all right. So again, that suggests that it must be doing something positive to pay for the costs. So we can't do a controlled experiment where we, impose prohibition. We take an identical culture and we split it into two groups and have a control group that keeps drinking, and then we have a group that we impose prohibition on. But history has kind of done that itself in a natural experiment, right? Mm-hmm. Prohibition, people have been trying to impose prohibition. It's not like it's a new idea. Ancient China, one of the earliest legal prohibition legal statutes we have from China is a prohibition statute that threatens anyone drinking alcohol with death. So it's pretty serious, and yet it comes from the same tomb that's chock full of these enormous drinking vessels. So people didn't stop drinking, and China as a culture has done pretty well. So.
There's a great quote that you use in your book from Frederick the Great, the German leader in 1777, and he's complaining about his subjects drinking. He's not complaining about them drinking alcohol. He's complaining about them drinking coffee instead of drinking beer. And he says, "It is disgusting to notice the increase in the quantity of coffee used by my subjects and the amount of money that goes out of the country as a consequence. Everybody is using coffee. This must be prevented. My people must drink beer. His Majesty was brought up on beer, so we were both his ancestors and officers. Many battles have been fought and won by soldiers nourished on beer, and the king does not believe that coffee-drinking soldiers can be relied upon to endure hardships in case of another war."
Yeah, that's a great quotation.
I mean, one might have thought that the leader would appreciate sober-minded subjects, but maybe not so much.
Yeah. No, I mean, the beer drinking soldiers bond. Beer drinking soldiers forge a sense of identity that allows them to do crazy things like risk their lives for one another or go out into battle. I mean, going into battle, running out into battle is, again, for a primate, a really kind of dumb thing to do. We should be wanting our genes to get passed on. We shouldn't be making sacrifices for the group. And yet we do. And there are a lot of ways to get people to feel this groupishness, so this feeling of bonding or cohesion that you need in an army or any type of group, cultural group, really. You can use religion. So a lot of my previous work has been on the way religion's been used in this way. So rituals, beliefs, but alcohol is another way to do it. And often they're actually more effective when they're combined. So a lot of religions, use chemical intoxicants in conjunction with rituals and beliefs in certain kind of deities to get people to have a sense of unity in the face of course, in the face of other groups, right? So creating an in-group is creating out-groups, but that's how it's worked historically.
One of the things I also found very interesting was, how societies began to organize themselves or could be organized to sort of control alcohol intake, because you're saying that it's not that everybody's just going out and getting so drunk that they fall down on, but the level of intoxicants is moderated. Mm-hmm. And you had some pretty interesting examples in the book of how, depending on where you are in society, that helps control alcohol intake.
Yeah, so that's the other main danger of modernity. So I talk about the twin banes of modernity when it comes to alcohol. One of them is distillation, so making alcohol wildly more powerful than it ever has been before. But the other is isolation. So the fact that historically, people have never had private access to alcohol. Like the fact that I can go to my fridge and grab some Viognier is historically unprecedented. Typically, alcohol production was a public thing. It was controlled by the society. In cultures where it is made in the household, there are often very strict taboos against drinking your own alcohol. So you produce it in your home, but you have to go to other people's homes to drink. And so cultures have constructed very elaborate ritual protocols around drinking to help people control their drinking. So you have toasting traditions. So you can't, we're all together drinking. No one can drink until someone makes a toast. And usually there's someone in charge of deciding who gets to make the toast and how often toasts are made. I talk about the Greek symposia, so these wine parties were run by a symposiarch, the head of the symposium.
I want to be a symposiarch.
You want to be a symposiarch? You should get a T-shirt that says that, right?
I think so, or a hat.
That's actually good. Or a hat. Yeah. I'm a symposiarch. I decide when the bowl gets passed around.
Yeah.
I decide the Greeks drank their wine mixed with water, and so I decide how strong or weak to make the mixture. And so the symposiarch is controlling things. And if things are kind of slowing down a little bit, maybe he'll up the alcohol content a bit. If they're getting out of hand, he'll dial it down. And you drink from the cup when it comes around, and that's it. You're not sitting there drinking at will. In a Chinese banquet, and this is true to the present day, you have this little cup of baijiu that's really strong, really usually pretty nasty sorghum liquor. But you don't sit there sipping it. It sits at your place, and you don't drink it until someone makes a toast. And then everyone says ganbei, make your cup dry, and you do a shot, and then someone refills your cup. But the pace of that toasting is controlled by the host. And so drinking for humans has always been social, and it's always been socially regulated. And what gets really dangerous is when suddenly I can go to a drive-through liquor store in my SUV and load it up with vodka and firearms and pornography and drive home and have all that stuff in my house. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. So I don't think we're evolutionarily designed to drink alone, essentially. And most problem drinking happens in the home. And I think a good example of this is the pandemic. There's really good evidence that people stuck at home in lockdown, but with access to liquor delivery, right? You can have people actually deliver liquor to your house. Problem drinking has gone way up. Domestic abuse has gone up. All these negative things that happen when people are drinking excessively have gone up because drinking's been taken out of its natural home, which is the pub, which is the symposium. It's a public thing where we're drinking together, usually with food in a way that's regulated. You take away that context and those social controls, and it really is it's a dangerous substance.
Twice a show.
I
should have to toast now. You have to take a drink every time I do that. I'm losing the motor control.
He's watering down the wine.
It's all happening. It's all bad. Woo. Okay. So, but it's kind of interesting because that suggests that as so often seems true in life, that you have this twin-edged sword, that the thing that's your superpower is also your weakness, right?
Yeah.
So alcohol is a little bit of a superpower. It helps us to bond. It helps us to be more creative. It helps us to trust. It helps us to determine whether I can trust you because you're drinking, and are you an honest sort, or do you seem conniving as you're trying not to drink, etc. But at the same time, it's got this terrible dark side, so that your superpower is also your kryptonite. You're from Krypton, and it's also kryptonite can kill you. So it puts a real challenge, it would seem to me. We have some questions about different societies that come up and how they deal with it, but it seems in a more general way it's a real challenge for any society to think about that and come up with rules that would A, make sense, and that B, that people will follow.
Yeah, I call Dionysus a two-faced god, right? Because of this, it has this. Dionysus gives these gifts,
and he's a Greek god, right?
He's a Greek god, and he's the god who gave Midas the golden touch. So he gives you these gifts that seem wonderful, but then they turn out to maybe not be so great. He's potentially dangerous. One of the threads of the book is talking about the mythology around Dionysus, because I think it's a powerful way to think about both the function, the positive aspects of alcohol, but also the dangers. So the Greeks respected Dionysus and gave him a place in the pantheon, but they also feared him a bit. And his followers were a little scary. So he had these followers, the Maenads, who would meet in the woods and get drunk and experience ecstasy, which was great. They were bonding, they were creative, they were getting in contact with the gods. But if you wandered across them in the woods, they would chase you down and tear you limb from limb. So they were also very dangerous. So that's why, again, this is why cultures always hedge alcohol with all of these safeguards, right? There's you can only have it in public. You only have it in certain ways. You only have it with certain people. You only have it at certain times of the day. There's lots of ways we do this. And I think we don't recognize how much of this is happening even in modern life. So if you are drinking in the pub, there's no symposiarch, there's no formal toasting, and yet you're regulated, right? For one thing, you have to wait for the bartender or the server to bring you a drink. Typically, people don't just order as much as they want. You do it in rounds, right? So if Rick, as is his wont, just powers through his beer and is getting a little sloppy, he's got to wait for.
Wait a minute, we've met before? I didn't realize that we've been out together.
Yeah, we've been out together. So you have to wait for Chris and I to finish our beers before you can get your next one. That helps regulate you.
Yeah.
Ideally, bartenders and servers function as symposiarchs, essentially. They cut you off when you've had too much to drink. One of the practical guidelines I recommend at the end of the book is, so I was a waiter for a decade in San Francisco and worked in bars and restaurants. And in the US, at least, there's really perverse incentives for serving staff. So we make all of our money through tips. And the best way to get tips is to get people drunk. It runs up the tab and it makes them feel generous and it lowers their cognitive control. And so they will give you more money. But that isn't really what we should be doing. We should actually be symposiarchs. We should be monitoring people's intake, and when they've clearly had too much, getting them to taper down. It's hard to do that when that's directly against your financial interest. And so I think if we started paying bartenders and servers in restaurants that serve alcohol real salaries, so they weren't completely dependent on tips, you would cut down drunk driving by half, right? They would be able to serve the normal function that people in society serve in moderating other people's alcohol consumption. So there's some really practical takeaways like that.
So,
Go.
I just earlier we had a question from one of our listeners. What were some of the challenges of researching this book, since it touches on so many disciplines, such a huge expanse of time? I mean, how did you go about tackling this, and kind of any challenges that came up in the process?
The same way I'd research anything. So I'd pick a couple books that are clearly central to the field. So, for instance, Dwight Heath is an anthropologist. He's kind of the grandfather of the anthropology of alcohol. So I read everything Dwight Heath has read. And then I read his references. So I read the stuff that he refers to. So I follow these different threads in things that I read that lead me to other literature. And I also use the same technique I use. So, I was trained as a humanities scholar, as a sinologist, religious studies scholar. And then I got into the cognitive sciences and evolutionary theory and those things. And the way I got into that was just finding colleagues who were experts in those fields and saying, hey, can I buy you a beer and talk to you for an hour? Right. And, because if you're trying on your own to get into a new area, you don't know where to start, right? You jump into a new secondary literature, you could start in a really weird place and not know that, this person, let's say, is not representative of the field in general. So you sit down with 2 or 3 people who are experts in that field and you say, what's the best stuff to read? What are the battle lines on this topic? And that's the way you do it, through talking to people who are experts and can point you in the right direction. So I had in the writing of this, I had a lot of help from colleagues in psychology, people who know about genetics, and they can point me, they say, hey, here's 20 things you need to read. So that's the only way to do it, is rely on a community, essentially, of people.
Well, this is actually our second show dealing with drinking in history, because we also had on, I don't know if you know Tom Standage in his book, The History of the World in 6 Glasses.
Oh, no, I don't know that. Okay.
Well, clearly you should. It showed. Believe me, it showed. No, not at all. But he takes a bit of a different and more anecdotal spin on the involvement not only of alcohol but also coffee, tea, and Coca-Cola. So I think it's beer, wine, spirits, coffee, tea, Coca-Cola, trying to tell the history of the world through those 6 drinks. So there's lots of stuff out there. I have to say, with all the fields that you're involved in, you remind me of the guy who at the coffee shop many years ago, when I was sort of straddling 2 lines, trying to see which one was going to be shorter, and he came up behind me and he growled, "Pick a line!" Right?
Yeah.
You have a wonderful bunch of diffuse things that you're involved in there, and finding great ways to connect them. But look, if alcohol is so important to our cultural development, to our civilization's development, why hasn't anthropology, history, science, learned people paid more attention to its civilization building role? It feels like you're sort of trying to establish a marker out there and say, pay attention to this. Well, why haven't people been paying attention?
Yeah. because we're Puritans. We don't know it. It's weird. It's so, one of the areas that I got into post PhD was cognitive science of religion and cognitive science of ritual. And if you look at the literature on that, they talk about synchrony, they talk about singing, physical exertion, and how that helps, downregulate the PFC. Maybe they talk about sleep deprivation, about how pain works. No one ever talks about the fact that all the people doing this through most of history around the world were also wasted, or they were high on mushrooms, or they were no one talks about the intoxicants. And I think it's this weird, just Puritan discomfort with chemical intoxicants or with pleasure. I actually don't entirely understand what it is. But I talk about Mircea Eliade, who's kind of one of the founders of religious studies, and wrote this big book on shamanism that was the standard treatment of the subject. And he talks about shamans, he talks about all the things they do. And at one point he's like, yeah, some of them, take mushrooms or maybe get drunk, but that's a debased form of mysticism. True mysticism is when, you do it without the chemical substances. And he doesn't have any data for it. The only reason for that judgment is this kind of sniffy Puritan attitude, I think. So there's this weird discomfort with chemical intoxicants that I think has really created a blind spot in the literature. I'm actually talking to some colleagues now who do this kind of work to say, hey, let's try to. And the other problem is, looking at this experimentally is hard. It's really hard to get human subject approval to do alcohol studies. So there are also just some really practical barriers. But the practical barriers are really, in turn, a result of Puritanism. Why is it hard to get human subject approval? Because IRB boards don't like to let you get undergraduates drunk.
That's why you had to give alcohol to all those fruit flies.
Yeah, that's the only way to do it is fruit flies. They're actually pretty good models for humans in a bunch of different ways. But it's a strange blind spot. And so part of what I'm hoping to do in the book, I want us to fill this blind spot in history, so we don't tend to talk about it much when we're looking at history. We don't tend to talk about it much when we're looking at religions, when we're doing comparative religion, or we're talking about ritual. And I think that's a problem. And I'm hoping we can fix it. So I'm just trying to shine a light on an area that I think's been neglected.
Edward Ted Slingerland, thank you so much for joining us today, for having a beer with us, and explaining to us why History Happy Hour always gets better in the second half. And, it's fabulous. I'm sorry, everybody.
Subtle uptick in quality.
That's right. It's a terrific book and a fun book, and you should definitely take a look at it. And the title of the book, it's easy to remember. It's called Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. It got a great review in the New York Times, and it's a terrific story. And Ted, thank you so much for joining us today from Vancouver. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Exactly. Enjoy.
Okay, and Chris, we must be done because I am out.
I know, right?
That is certainly a sign. So, and next week
you are on fire tonight, Rick. I gotta say,
I'm muting myself multiple times. I am. I don't know what it is. We'll have to give some more alcohol to some more fruit flies to figure it out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fruit flies in this book. I don't want to put anybody off. There are fruit flies. Chris, I didn't even give you a warning on this, but so I'll just throw it at you here to tell us about next week's guest. And I'll give you a visual cue here, and I'll talk it up enough that you have a moment to remember what we're doing. Tell us about our guest next week.
Well, I mean, it's everybody likes to hear stories about the Great Escape and escapes during World War II, and we've all seen the movies and we know the stories. But there's a whole other story about POWs in World War One and how they were treated and what they endured. And The Confidence Men by Marguerite Fox, as the cover implies, is the story of two British officers who escape from the Ottoman Turks. It's got to be one of the most remarkable escapes in history, and I will just tease you with saying it involves a Ouija board.
Oh, is there any drinking?
Well, of course there's drinking. Okay. Now we know everything. Even if it's not there, there's drinking.
Right. We'll be bringing that up for weeks. So.
You
But anyway, thank you everybody for joining us today on
everybody.
History Happy Hour. We really appreciate your being here.
Thanks so much. Be safe, everybody.